Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and in today's lecture we're going to be talking about what world history is and why we study world history. Now, the rise of world history has been one of the most important developments in American history education and scholarship over the past 2 decades. There are three major approaches to world history, usually applied in combination, that help scholars decide what topics to focus on. The first approach involves studying major civilizations to determine how they developed and how they helped define the experience of many people and societies around the world. This approach brings major civilizations together to compare what they share and how they differ. The second approach involves paying attention to cases where major societies, including civilizations, come into contact with each other. Scholars look at how this contact occurs and how it changes both parties, using this information as a framework to explore far-reaching changes in the experience of peoples around the world. The third approach emphasizes the emergence of broader forces that help define contacts and experiences of individual civilizations. Such forces include new trade or migration patterns, new disease patterns, and new missionary efforts. Now, these three approaches are usually used in combination. These three approaches also help us define key time periods in world history. Now, although we won't be covering all these time periods, it's important to know how historians in world civilization often break up all of world history. The time periods, in turn, are often delineated by changes in patterns of contact or changes in broader forces, such as the diffusion of new technologies or the emergence of new trade patterns. Now, the time periods in a global history course that starts from prehistory to modern times can be broken up as follows. We have the classical period, which runs from about 1000 BCE to 500 CE, the post-classical period from 500 to 1450, the early modern period, where this course begins from 1450 to around 1750-1800, the long 19th century from 1750 to 1914, and then our contemporary period. Now, the rise of world history as an academic discipline has been unusual in several respects. World history emerges more as a teaching field than as a research field. That's how it emerged. It did not develop initially at the most prestigious universities in the United States, and the field of world history is not evenly developed around the world. A great deal of progress has been made in the US, and interesting work has been done in China and Japan. A few European countries, such as the Netherlands, have developed significant world history programs as well. But the United Kingdom, although it contributes important scholarship to world history, has yet to really introduce the topic in its educational programs. Now, three factors fuel the increasing interest in world history. The first factor involves changes in the composition of the American student body. A growing number of students in American universities come from backgrounds that are not American, and there is a demand for teaching that reflects this diversity. The second factor is the extent to which the US, since the 1950s, has become engaged with non-European world. Now, this engagement logically propels us to look for a historical perspective that gives us some context for understanding the world at large, rather than one important but narrow slice of it. And the world history perspective can also be used to gain a better understanding of crucial historical events and processes. Now, we also need to look at the debate surrounding the idea of teaching world history. World history inevitably challenges older teaching approaches, particularly the tradition of Western civilization. Now, this continues to generate disputes between world history advocates and traditionalists. The Western civilization tradition traces a line of historical development from ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt to Greece and to Rome, then on to Western Europe, and ultimately to North America. Now, this approach asserts that because the US is part of the Western tradition, its students should pay particular attention to the emergence of Western institutions and values. Now, some world historians approach the teaching of world history as an exercise in a West bashing, but others take a more considered position. It is more important for American students to learn something about the world as a whole, including how the West fits into larger world patterns, than it is to learn about the Western tradition more narrowly. World historians argue that the opportunity to learn how the West developed, its distinctive features, and its contributions to the global experience is not lost in the study of world history, as opposed to Western civilization. The choice of world history in a teaching program involves a different set of emphases from the Western civilization tradition. Scholars of world history seek to avoid the West and the rest approach, which focuses on the Western experience with brief mentions of other societies. The more thoughtful approach looks at Western civilization as one of a number of major civilizations, and not always the most important one. Now, a second concern about the teaching of world history, raised particularly by historians of East Asian civilizations, is that the field cannot adequately convey the complexities of individual traditions. Chinese history, for example, is so nuanced and complex that it's inevitably simplified if taught as only one part of a broader course. Now, the third objection is raised recently as some historians have attempted to insert themselves into a world history framework, is that the field is somehow yet another product of American imperialism. Now, to some extent, this objection seems to coincide with criticisms of American foreign policy. It may also reflect on understandable anxiety that American world historians would slight the European experience, although most world historians in the US make an effort to deal even-handedly with the experiences of various societies. Now, in terms of chronology in world history, we need to be aware of three kinds of emphases. The first is the emphasis on origins. In the world history context, this approach pays greater attention to the emergence of human societies, sometimes at the expense of more recent developments. The second approach acknowledges that the greatest contributions of world history scholarship to our understanding of the past apply particularly to the post-classical period, from about 500 to 1450, and the time right after the early modern period. The final approach, and the one we will use, views both the early and middle phases of world history as contributing to an active modern period and uses the modern period in turn to help understand the world in the present day. Now, let's look at the overall framework and a few final definitions for the course. Now, world historians, like any analytically sensitive historians, are interested in the balance and tensions between change and continuity, one of our historical skills that we learn in this class. At times, world history seems to focus particularly on changes, but will also pay attention to continuities among human societies. The civilizational approach will help us track continuities and traditions in juxtaposition with the new elements in the global framework. Now, we will also look at the tensions between developments and identities formed in particular localities or regions and the advantages of contact and exposure to cross-cutting forces. Now, we'll see that up until about 1,000 years ago, the human experience probably placed more emphasis on the local and the regional than on contact and broader forces. And for the past 1,000 years up to today, the human experience places more emphasis on contact and cross-cutting forces and less emphasis on local and regional developments and identities. But the tension between the two elements is always present. Now, this course will look primarily at 7 civilizational geographical areas: East Asia, South and Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and later the Middle East and North Africa, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America. Now, we'll use BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era, as our main chronological divides. Now, this terminology replaces the traditional use of BC, before Christ, and AD, Anno Domini, in the year of the Lord, in world history. This conversion steers us away from the Christian definitions used in Western-focused history and reminds us that we are operating in a global environment. We'll also see different reasons for the choices of certain dates to mark specific periods. Now, world historians conventionally end the post-classical period around 1450, then pick up the early modern period, which will begin in this course. The year 1450 has some relationship to the Renaissance and the Reformation, major periods in traditional Western history, but the year also relates to important developments in the Middle East, in North Africa, Russia, and Eastern Europe, and in the relationship between the Americas and the rest of the world.